Hi. So, history is taught to us as a series of facts, often quite dry facts. But those facts are the pegging points of stories. There's always a story. But very often that story gets lost. Sometimes it's just lost in the details. Sometimes people become hyperfixated just on facts. But sometimes the story is lost due to an agenda. So when my mother reached old age, she became very interested in genealogy. And she was a very thorough, very academic woman, so she did it right. She found death certificates and birth certificates. She went overseas, she photographed tombstones, she photographed old medieval church registries. When she came back, she found out, to her delight, that my paternal great-grandfather had been quite a famous outback artist up in the north of Western Australia. And she found that he'd done huge murals in some of the pubs. Some of these still existed, and she was sent photographs of these. So she went up to meet the local historical society and try and find out if there were any more paintings and find out more facts about this gentleman's life. And she met these wonderful old women from the local historical society, and their eyes lit up when she explained who she was, and they just said, "Oh my God, you're the family of the inseminating Scottsman." And it turns out this guy was a beloved local figure. What had happened was, this old chap had come out from Aberdeen, was a very good artist. He would turn up in town having hitched a ride somehow, carrying this old rusty bicycle with him. And he could do murals at pubs, he could do behind the bar portraits, he could do some signage and so on, and it would give him drinking rights at the pub. So depression on you, no one was really paying anyone money. But he could drink there for a couple of weeks before he overstayed his welcome. So he made this nomadic route of all these country towns, and he would move to the next one and the next one, the next one, stay 2 weeks, drink himself silly and would move on. But all the husbands were out working in the mines for months at a time. So for the local women, the signal, if you wanted a bit, was you took your apron and you draped it over the garden gate, and that was the signal. And this Scotsman on a bicycle would veer in and he'd stay with you for a few days during his visit. Again, not trying to overstay his welcome with any one particular lady, free food, free board, and then he'd move on. So these women for the Historical Society were absolutely delighted. They said, "Well, you have hundreds of relatives up in this area that you don't know of." And of course, middle-class mother was scandalised. She was doing a book on all of this, which was going actually into the state library. This was going to be historical record. 2 versions of the book were created. One is the one that went into the libraries. She kept the one that had the story behind the facts, and she made 1 copy for her and 1 for me, because she didn't want this story to get out. Even though she'd uncovered it. She was well-meaning, but she actually lost what was a ripper of a story about this wonderful old guy. So I've been doing some looking at some other local history, and I found a cracker of a story. Crocodiles, escapes, adventures, fires, storm, it's great. But there's also a second story which was hidden behind the first. And it was hidden, again, for political agenda, and I think both stories should be told. So that's what we're going to look at today. Okay, so this is a tale of air action adventure with occasional outbreaks of crocodiles. Love those crocodiles. It's recorded in a few different sources that I've had to go through. There are official police records from the time, there are official newspaper records from the time. Hans Bertram was a German aviator who's central to the story. He recorded these things in a book. Now, all sources are suspect because all sources are coloured by the wishes of those who create them. So, Bertram's book is a cracking read. It changes and omits some things. Police reports are not a cracking read, and they served the point of view of the white police force of the time. Facts from the newspapers, again, they're looking for a cracking yarn in a different way. But, so, post-war years, there's a young aviator, Hans Bertram, and he's been absolutely enraptured by flight. So he's gone to a flight school in Hamburg and he has learned how to fly. While he's learning, there is a Chinese gentleman who's learning with him. And they become fast friends. They go to all the cafes together. He shows this guy German culture. We're talking early 1920s here. Then, when they've passed their course, the Chinese gentleman turns out to actually have some kind of uniform. And he says he's with the Chinese Navy, the Nationalist Navy, Chiang Kai-shek. And he turns to this fellow student, Hans Bertram, and he says, will you help me? I need some help. So they go around, they find the stats to different aircraft and different companies. And he writes them out for him, and the Chinese guy translates them. And the Chinese guy bids him farewell. But then, a few months later, as Bertram's looking for work, the Chinese guy telegraphs him and wants him to come out to China. They are trying to set up the Chinese Nationalist Naval Air Force, and they want an advisor. And he wants this guy to basically come and essentially push the idea of planes to the Chinese public. So they get some planes and they do some stunts and they fly around and they're trying to get donations from people to purchase aircraft. So Bertram goes back to Europe and he gets a job, and this is September by now. He's been doing this for a few years, so September 1931, he gets the job to transfer a seaplane to China. And the idea is they're going to go up the Chinese coast on a big tour, and they're going to try and whip up lots of enthusiasm. And so he's got a course that takes him down through Turkey, down through Arabia, across India, and then they're going to go to the South China Seas and up the Chinese coast. But they run afoul of a huge storm in the Bay of Bombay. They try and put down, and the plane, its wingtip clips a wave and they cartwheel in. The plane starts going down, and they had flown over a British merchant ship. That's it, they're going down, they can see nothing but waves, and then this lifeboat from a British ship just erupts out of the breakers around them, and they're just seized by these British sailors and they're dragged to safety. So there's a sort of an ignominious return now by land and sea to Germany, and that's where Bertram's story, A Flight into Hell, takes place. This is his flight to Australia. Clearly he loved the place. Now what Bertram says is, I simply organised another plane, and a year later off I went. We'll look at that. That's not actually what happened. But his narrative is that off they set. Again, at the behest of the Chinese, they were going to go and they were going to take pretty much the same route. However, aviation records say that this was an attempt to go around the world. So this is actually a pretty amazing venture at the time. These long flights are terrifying. There are no radios on the planes. Most cockpits are open. Most aircraft are just canvas and wood. And navigation is map, compass and best guess. Usually they're doing point-to-point navigation. They're following coasts that they recognise. They're going down roads. They're finding things they recognise. Bit terrifying. So this is why this route is island hopping. Bertram actually sets out with a team of 4. So there's himself, Hans Bertram. He has a mechanic, Adolf Scottsman. They've also got 2 other guys with them. They've got an official cameraman from a huge movie news network has turned up, and they've also got a co-pilot provided to them by the company that created the aircraft they're flying, the Junkers Corporation, an official pilot. The plane they're flying is a Junkers W-33. Now this is a treasured bush plane from the time. It is rugged, and a time when everything else is very much still wood and canvas. This thing's metal. It's got a duralumin frame, it's got metal wings, it's got reserve fuel tanks, it's got an inner cabin that can carry 4 people that's actually heated. This thing's rugged and it's designed not to break. And they take this and they fly the same sort of route. They go through Turkey, Arabia. This time they go down into south of India. They head across into Malaya and Indonesia. Now in Indonesia, for reasons that I have not been able to quite figure out, the official cameraman and the second pilot decide they're going to leave the expedition, they're going to get a ship to Shanghai, and they're going to meet Bertram and Co there when they come back to Shanghai. To me, by the way, this does not sound like a round-the-world trip, because they're choosing a difficult route. However, Bertram and Klaus, and they decide they're going to go onwards. Now, they meet in Jakarta the Chinese consul. So they do meet with the Chinese, and this guy says, we'd love you to go on a tour of Australia. There are lots of Chinese communities there, and we think you could sort of really ramp them up for donations. So they agree. It sounds really interesting. It's a side trip, but it's going to be a kind of a cool one. Australia is really unplumbed territory at the time. It's the fifth continent. Most of Australia is still blank on the maps. People just haven't crossed lots of it. So they go down through Indonesia, and they get to this little bay, and Bertram gives this wonderful description that he and his co-pilot, they're lounging around, lying on the floats of this seaplane that they are flying. So they've got two floats, plane on top, and suddenly this grotty old yacht turns up, and someone calls out to them in Berlin accented German, and it's a German guy who's just living in this bay. And when they talk to him, he just explains, no, I've given it up. Berlin, Germany, Europe, I'm tired of their old games, I'm tired of their old wars. You've got to live here in paradise. And he tells them just how wonderful it is living here, in the South Seas. And he tells them, have you seen the stars out here at night? Have you flown at night? This guy has, says you have to fly at night. The stars are reflected in the sea. It's just so romantic. So he kindles this idea in these two guys. Yes, yeah, let's do a night flight. And this is kind of why I love Hans Bertram. He is a lovable character. The kid's 26. He tends to do things off the cuff, and he's a romantic. Let's fly at night. So they fly down to a little bay where they've been told there's fuel, and a fuel boat eventually turns up. And, well, it takes ages. You've got to pour this thing in cans into the plane. They get it filled. By that time, it's night, and there just doesn't seem to be any time to go shopping at the little town. So what the hell? They have 6 bananas, so they just sort of eat some bananas. That's all right. They've got a course going from this end of East Timor, across the Timor Sea, to Darwin in Australia. 7 hours flying time. We're going to take off at midnight. Breakfast in Darwin. We'll just have us a big breakfast. So off they go. No food. They haven't taken any reserve fuel cans or anything with them, because what the hell are things for? And they just have a paper map and a compass bearing which says Darwin that way, and off they go. They take off at midnight, and at first they're enjoying it, but it's actually quite grueling. Again, these planes have to be flown by muscle. It's very tiring holding these things. And yeah, the stars are reflected in these dark seas, but with a shock they suddenly realise they're only like 10 metres off the surface. So they start trying to climb, and then things start to go a bit strange. A fog closes in, they keep trying to get above it, and they realise there's a wind that's actually buffeting the plane, but they can't really see it. Everything's a fog all around them. They fly and they fly. The fuel gauge is lovely. It's a tube with, hand to God, it's got a cork floating in it. They've actually seen this aircraft. It's lower and lower and lower, no sign of land. And then, finally, they do see a glimmer of coast. They're exhausted, they're frozen, absolutely frozen, because they're in this open cockpit. The cockpit's open, the cabin is heated. So they manage to find a sheltered bay, and they get this thing down to a beach, and they just fall asleep, unconscious, absolutely exhausted. In the morning they'll figure out where they are, and they'll just take off and they'll follow the coast and they'll get there. Alright. So they wake up in the morning to hear a cheerful noise. And there's an Aboriginal gentleman, one of the Australian natives. He's just there on the beach and he's waving to them, and he just climbs onto the floats because they've nosed this thing up, and they sit there trying to find a shared language with this guy. He's very friendly, he's very open, he's really interested in what the hell is this thing and what are you guys doing here, but there's no way to communicate. So they just talk for a while, and then they explain to this native that we're moving on now. So he gets it and he gets off and he waves them farewell. So these guys examine their tanks. They've got 13 litres of fuel left in the tank. Time for maybe 40 minutes flying. But they've got reserve tanks, which they're pretty sure must have another 45 in it, but they're really keen to be off. They figure that as they've come down through the sea, they've landed on this huge island that's just somewhat north of Darwin, Melville Island. And according to their map, about 15 kilometres away, there's a little town. So they decide, we'll just fly to the town. So they just take off, and off they go. And they fly, and there's no town, and they fly, and there's no town. And the plane just, the engine cuts out. They're desperate, they're gliding in, and then they do see there's a narrow bay, perfect for a seaplane. Remember I told you about tipping the wing the last time? Bertrand's very worried about that happening again. But this has some quite high headlands around it that cut off the air. Little beach, so down they come, and the plane cuts off. Engine's dead. They check their spare fuel and they find there is none. They basically untie the cork to let it run into some cans, and 3 litres run out, and that's it. So they are right royally screwed. They get it in their head first that they're in a little headland, there must be a creek, there must be fresh water. We'll be okay as long as there's fresh water. They search for 2 hours, and this is northern Australia, northwest. It's blistering hot. Our 2 little guys who've flown out from Cologne, they're not suited to it. So they're absolutely dying here. They come back and there's no water, so they know they've seen one person, the native that they met, and they've only gone about 15 kilometres. Hello, Mr. Regan. So what they do is they decide, we're going to walk back and we're going to find him. They outfit themselves only in the lightest stuff they can, European as they can. Bertrand absolutely admits this. They put on solar topies, long socks, let us not forget the long socks and the shorts. There's flies everywhere which are driving them mad, so they keep their flying goggles, and they take a canvas bag which they fill with water. It's the only water they've got. They've drained it from the radiator of the plane. It's oily. When they first taste it, they spit it out. It's too revolting, but they take it with them just in case. They're going to find this native, and they'll be out of here. He will take them to a fishing village, which they're certain Australia must be dotted with for some reason. So they start walking, and they start walking, and they start walking. The flies drive them mad. And it takes them 3 days. And day 1, almost hour 1, they fall over and they rip the water bag. All the water's gone, just gone. And they decide, do we turn back and get a new bag and refill it? No, they're absolutely fixated. This is actually a pilot problem, mission fixation. Plus they're 20 and they've been raised on this idea of dynamic action. Futurism is in. A man takes his own fate into his own hands. We'll find this guy. So they just keep going. No water. Blazing heat. Mosquitoes at night. And they come to this saltwater estuary. They know they've got to cross it, and it looks like it goes quite some way inland. So they take off all of their clothes and their shoes, and they make little parcels out of them, and they decide to swim across this estuary. Well, they get halfway across, and what lives in saltwater estuaries in northern Australia? Our old friends, the crocodiles. So, to their absolute terror, they see these crocodiles come off the bank and start arrowing towards them. They abandon their clothes and they swim like crazy, desperately heading for the banks, and they scramble up into the rocks and they run. And in absolute terror, they're up there and they see these crocodiles cruise around, and that's it, they're terrified. And they're now up on some slightly highlands, and they can see there's just empty land in the direction they're going, which was east, back towards where they saw this Aboriginal. So there's no water, they're absolutely dying here. So they decide they're going to turn around and head back. Alright, so back they walk. Naked, no shoes, no water, no food. Absolute hell as they stagger forward. They do eventually get back to the plane. Yeah, where they drink the water. So they decide, look at their maps and say, alright, forget the native, we'll go west to where they've decided there must be a town. If they are on Melville Island, they'll go to the town. But walking has been an absolute nightmare for them. Mosquitoes, rocks, their feet are blistered, they're covered in sores. So what they do is they decide to take off one of the floats from the float plane, which does have little access hatches in the top. They put some sand in the bottom of ballast, they drain out all the rest of the water from their radiator, and they knot up an old raincoat to make a water bag. They put that in there. Supplies, 3 cigars, 50 cigarettes, a pipe and pipe tobacco. Oh, they packed that all right, nothing else. So they try to get into this boat. They've made a makeshift mast and sail out of old raincoats, and but those headlands, the waves are absolutely smashing into that, and the weather gets worse and worse and worse. They try getting the boat out and they're almost smashed to pieces. They shelter. And then comes their first miracle. Storm sets in and it rains. So they race back to the plane and they pull out film canisters, plenty of those, and any tins they've got, and they fill this, and they're just laughing and they're drinking, and fantastic. It's a godsend. So now they pour this into the front section of their canoe. They've got water for the trip. They've got about 45 litres of water. Ideally, they should be drinking a couple of litres each a day, but they figure that's more than enough. So they wait and they decide to set out. They set out the next day and they decide, we almost got smashed to pieces trying to follow the rocks. What we need to do is we need to go out, away from the coast, and we'll just navigate and follow along. So out they go. And the ebb tide actually sucks them out and away from all of the coastline. They lose sight of land and they're just stuck. There's absolutely nothing out there. It is just absolutely nothing. They can feel the tides actually dragging them away. The sail is too small and the rudder is too small to actually propel or guide the ship. Scottsman starts to actually lose it. He starts babbling, and Hans Bertram suddenly realises that he's pretty much alone in this. But they paddle, and they paddle, and they paddle, and they just keep on going. They paddle for 9 days without break. Big heartbreak in the middle of this is a merchant ship goes past. They see it and they stand up and they've got flares. They fire off 5 flares as this thing approaches them, and they just know that they are rescued. This thing comes within 500 yards of them, doesn't see them, and just keeps on going. And it absolutely horrifies them. Scottsman just begins weeping in the boat. He's not handling this well. But they keep going, and they keep going, and they keep going, trying to reach this town, ironically called Cockburn, and suddenly one night, as they're trying to paddle in towards going south, they finally see a glimmer of light. It's a beach. They drag themselves back onto the shore, last of their energy, and they just fall asleep in the sand. And they wake up and they find they're in this place. They're not sure what to do. Their water is gone. They've drunk it all. So they start exploring. They've made some decisions. They've thrown away their pistol because they thought they might kill themselves with it. They've done the best job that they can of trying to keep flies away from themselves, but it's now been a long time without food. They do catch one little fish. It's smaller than their hand, and that's all they can eat. So when the next day dawns, they start exploring this area, their second miracle happens. They find a waterhole. In fact, they've stumbled across the only waterhole in about 1,000 kilometres of coast. It is there all year round. It never dries up. The natives actually refer to it as big water. So they just plunge into it. They're laughing, they're crying, they're bathing their sores, and alright, they're still convinced that they're on Melville Island. And Melville Island, the shape of it, they figure there must be a promontory which extends up. They're going to cut across the promontory. They're going to go south. They get their raincoat water bag, they fill it full of water at this waterhole, and the next day they set out and they start walking inland. And every step, they're actually blacking out as they walk because they haven't eaten for so long. They keep walking and they keep walking, and they're crawling half the time. It's now been almost a month without food. Finally, they climb up onto this jagged rocky promontory, and they look down and they see what they think is the ocean, and they're just so overjoyed because there it is spread out in front of them, and they're just absolutely weeping with joy because they know they've reached the ocean. All we have to do is follow the coast along and we'll find this town. And then suddenly it dawns, it's not the ocean, it's the Kimberleys. This is one of the great wastelands of planet Earth. There is nothing, it's just cracked, baked rock for hundreds of kilometres. It's bigger than Germany. And they're in it. They're not on Melville Island, and that's when they suddenly have to have a rethink. They're not stupid. They realise they must not have been blown in the direction they went. They think and they figure we've been blown to the west of our target. The nearest town, if this is the Kimberleys, which it has to be, must be Wyndham, which is east back all the way they've come. And to their incredible credit, they don't give up. They turn right around and they decide they're going to march back to their waterhole, refill the water bag, refill that canoe, and this time they're going to try following the coast east, and they're going to get to Wyndham. They drag their way back, and they find while they've been away, waves have actually reached up and grabbed their boat where they pulled it up on the shore and have smashed it up against the rocks. Half of the boat, the whole front half, is just staved in. But they did bring some tools with them. So they, exhausted and just weaving on their feet, they managed to saw the front off this canoe because it was all shattered. And they've made this little truncated thing. They fill up their water and somehow they find the energy to get out there again. Hi, Bertie. And they start following the coast around, but this time the boat, it's too short and it's too light. It's been hurled around like a cork. Bad weather comes back, and it only has 3 fingers of freeboard around it, so waves are just smashing over them. They're almost drowning with every single gush of the waves. So they come all the way around the coast, and finally they have to get out. They see a little narrow cove, and they head into it just as the waves are really rising. They manage to get in there, and there they are, they're stuck, and this is it, they're really blacking out. It's been a month without food now. They climb up into these rocks, frozen, and they kind of realise they're not going to make it. They're just not going to make it. So they look for a place to die. Scottsman's raving. Hans manages to find a cave, and he gets him up to this cave that overlooks the shore, and he just tries to make his friend as comfortable as he can. He's losing teeth. He has to tear his own teeth out with pliers that they brought with them. Inexplicably, they brought pith helmets and pliers. And they're just living in this little cave. Day after day after day, just weathering away. They try to fish. They can't find mussels, they can't fish, they don't have the strength anymore, they can just sort of lie there. And then they suddenly hear these voices, and to their astonishment, there's an Australian native leaping from rock to rock, and Scottsman just leaps to his feet somehow and just gives out this hellish yell. And this native turns around and he yells to others, and they find those guys. and they look after them. When Hans published his book, he actually started it with a preface. This is in the German version, translated. He says, "We were found by natives of Australia, naked black men. Those Samaritans of the wilds tended and cared for us. Their treatment of us showed a generosity that I have rarely met with in any people anywhere in the world. In order to thank the Aborigines of Australia, I am writing this account." That's his dedication. So, Hans and Alf are so weak they can't chew. These native guys, 3 of them, they find fish, and one of them goes off hunting and just comes back with kangaroo. They have to actually chew the food for the lost aviators. These guys can't chew anymore, so they're actually pre-chewing food and just feeding it to them, tiny handful by tiny handful, day after day. A whole family group turns up, wives, kids, and they start gathering more food for these guys. They've got some flour, which is obviously a very precious substance, and they make it. And they ritually present these 2 aviators with a kangaroo tail, which is actually quite a gift. Kind of means you're one of the family. Okay, so these Australian natives are looking after these guys, chewing food for them, bringing them prize gifts, flour. They're bringing them. They're making bread. They're chewing food, giving these guys kangaroo tails. They pick them up and they take them to that big waterhole, the place everybody knows, because they've sent runners to tell the local mission. I say local, it's 60 kilometres away, and say that they found these guys because they were looking for them. And here's where the thing gets ironic. These guys are found because of our old friend the crocodiles. When they leapt into the water and put all of their clothes there, and when they ran away, their clothes continued to float and they wound up on the shore. An unnamed native Australian, and it may even have been the guy that they found on that very first day. He found, washed up on the shore, a handkerchief and a silver cigarette case. By the way, if you're adventuring out in the wilds, always take your silver cigarette case with you. But they were monogrammed. This guy goes about his business, but he walked in to this mission that was 60 kilometres away, and he mentioned that he'd found these items in the middle of nowhere to the local missionary, who looked at them, and the missionary saw that the monograms on these things matched Hans Bertram. This is now in the papers and everything that these guys are missing. They have been searching for them, but they figured that these guys might in fact, ironically, have been on Melville Island, because if you were blown off course and running out of fuel, you go for the big island that's closer. Never crossed their minds that these guys were 500 kilometres away along the shore. So, armed with our crocodile information, they actually send messages to friendly Aboriginal groups along the coast there and say, look for these guys, and they send runners out from the mission. Can anybody in this area look for these? These are the ones that have actually found them. These guys have been told, 2 aviators, German, find them, and they did. A posse is organised from Wyndham. News comes in from this native group, we found them. They get mules, they get medicine, they get food, and they come out and find them. Unfortunately, when the white rescue party arrives, Scottsman has completely lost it. And I've sent the ambulances after him. No, he is completely lost it. He's decided everyone is actually in league trying to kill him. He attempts to murder everyone. The policeman wakes up to find Hans Bertram is actually struggling with this guy, trying to stop him. He's gone for the guns that the guys have got. And Bertram's trying to save everybody. He's just a stick figure himself. He's so emaciated. So they end up having to put the poor mechanic in restraints. They get everyone back to Wyndham, into hospital. Poor old Glassman, he ends up in a straitjacket. Now, his story, unfortunately, from there is he can't take going in the air anymore. He does actually take months to recover his sanity. He takes a long voyage back to Germany by sea, and he does get better. Kind of disappears from the narrative. Hans Bertram, however, is a hero. He is befriended by the chap that runs the tiny little West Australian airline, who's come all the way out to meet him. They go out and they find the plane, which is still in working condition. It has in fact had some local Aborigines from that area go through it. Some Aborigines have wandered through. And the plane had been found by a search party earlier on. If they'd stayed with the plane, they would have been found. But they didn't know what they didn't know. They're not us, they weren't taught these things. This is, by the way, hammered into Australian school children. Stay with the vehicle. But they managed to get a float from another type of float plane, an Australian float plane, put it on, take this thing off, and they fly it down to Perth where they receive a hero's welcome. They land around about 200 yards from where I'm sitting, out on the South Perth foreshore. And Bertram is very, very grateful to Australia because he finds that this has been a huge effort. All of West Australia's turned out to try and find him through all of this. They were just looking 500 kilometres away from where he was. He goes on a triumphant tour. The plane needs servicing. He calls Junkers, who send people out to repair it. He does this tour, and then he's had enough. He's going home. He does actually take a sea trip to Shanghai. Says hello to the Chinese, but he's obviously not doing this Chinese trip anymore. He flies solo, which is a particularly heroic feat at the time, and he does it. He gets all the way back to Germany. In Germany, he's an absolute hero. He publishes this book, Flight to Hell, and he becomes quite a celebrity. And for now, there ends Bertram's story. However, it's a heroic tale, but it leaves some questions. What were they doing out there? A Junkers W-33 is a really expensive plane at the time because these were cutting-edge technology. It outsells its other competitors, but it's $11,000 US to purchase at the time, $9,000 for the competitors. When you look through the records, when this guy gets into trouble, he calls Junkers and Junkers come. He has a Junkers co-pilot. The plane is provided by Junkers. He doesn't go out and just find a plane, he's given one by the Junkers Aircraft Corporation. And as it turns out, the Junkers Aircraft Corporation had a vision. They wanted to reach out and start all these little airlines around the world. Hans Junkers, who ran the Junkers company, was an interesting man. He had a vision, and his vision is what sent these guys to Australia where they accidentally got lost. It's a beautiful vision, and it's been usurped. His story was stolen by the Nazis, and that is the second part of this tale. Okay. When I first saw the aircraft that Hans Bertram had flown in, I was a bit taken aback. This is a Junkers. Now, Junkers aircraft are the quintessential Nazi aircraft. These guys are the flagship of the Blitzkrieg. Junkers made the Ju-87 Stuka. They made the Ju-88, which is the primo medium bomber of the Blitzkrieg. They went onwards. It was Junkers engines that powered Nazi jets. The Me-262, the Arado. Those are all Junkers. These guys are very Nazi. They used slave labour. Thousands of people died as concentration camp labour who were working for Junkers. So, bad vibe. It's a stolen legacy. So let me tell you about Hans Junkers and about the wonderful group of socialists and communists who were the cutting edge of air technology in the 1920s in Germany. Right, so Professor Hans Junkers, he's an interesting chap. So he's born in 1859, and this is an age of the inventors. He actually worked with Edison. His whole thing is thermodynamics. He's very interested in gas engines, which he gets some patents of, but very early on, he invents the patent for a gas stove. And this design is still used today. And this was his money spinner, by the way, all through. He also invents the gas water heater. And all those elements are still used today. A lot of those paintings are still Junkers paintings. But he became engaged with the Voisin company in France, helping them out with some engine ideas, and he became bewitched by flight. And he saw this thing as this amazing, liberating thing. And he developed a vision. One thing, his diaries are still with us, and in there he constantly tells us his passion is to be an innovator and to make new things. But he pioneered long-distance passenger flight. All he wanted to do, passengers and cargo. He got together these aircraft to make the first flight from Europe to America. I'll just read you something. This is the speech that he gives, and this is the man's vision. He says, "We must expect from aviation not merely the building of aircraft of many different types, but also the fulfillment of political and economic tasks. We must utilize aircraft to bring peoples closer together. My highest life goal is, through the productive struggle to bring both material and cultural prosperity to mankind, this transoceanic flight should help this goal come true. Air transport should not only be free from all politics within Germany but also without. Instead of aircraft being instruments of war, we must make aircraft weapons of freedom and of mankind. This Junkers aircraft, when it touches down on American soil, it will be a messenger of peace, and we hope that all the other nations of the world will join us in this great mission." What he believed was that borders would vanish when aircraft travelled. A line on the ground means nothing when you're flying over it, but also as we visit each other so swiftly and so easily, our differences vanish. A German can't hate a Frenchman if you're there for lunch. It's just you're cross-pollinating, and the difference between America and Europe. And this was the guy's mission. Hans Junkers was a dedicated pacifist. He was a dedicated Democrat, a democratic socialist. He created a company that became a thorn in the side for industrialists at the time. He championed the 8-hour working day. He championed social programs for workers, housing for workers, family care for workers. He treated his workmen as individual craftsmen, and he had a program of development where people are taught new jobs and new craftsmanship. So he completely eschewed Henry Ford's idea of the production line, where people are just robots and do a single job. Junkers was the place to work if you were a hands-on tool guy. This was where you wanted to work, but it was also the place to work if you were an innovator, because he gathered around him the brightest minds of a generation, and they were the innovators that were making stuff that we still use today. Let's just have a look. Who were his mates? Well, Robert Bosch. Now, Robert Bosch, so this guy, famous liberal businessman, he invented some really nifty stuff, like fuel injection for diesels. He also invented spark plugs. You're probably using Bosch spark plugs in your car, if you have a petrol-driven car. Now, during World War I, all of these German industries were basically seized by the government and forced to go into war production. Bosch refused to take any profit whatsoever from those forced sales, and he turned it all to building hospitals. Interesting guy. We will follow up what happened with him afterwards. Another man from amongst the innovators that the professor had on his team, Adolf Dirthmann, close friend. This guy founded the KADP, the Communist Workers' Party of Germany. He then had an argument with them because he didn't want an overthrowing of society so much as a change to more socialist principles. So he started another communist party, which was far more gentle than the more revolutionary Workers' Party. So he eventually becomes managing director of Junkers. So this is one of their main guys. The other people that Junkers hangs out with, Walter Gropius from the Bauhaus, the artistic movement. So he's hanging out with these sorts of people. This is his life. These are the voices he's hearing. So World War One, he's working on these passenger aircraft, and he wants rugged, reliable. So when everyone else is just doing things made out of stick and canvas, his things are made out of duralumium, which is an aluminium alloy, and they're coated with metal. These things don't break. Even when the government forces him to make warplanes, he focuses on reliability and pilot protection. His motto is "Bring the man home." Says he must return to the house. So he's he makes a sort of an armoured bathtub, which is actually still used in A-10s and so on today as a principle, protect the pilot. But he continues trying to work on his peace projects and indeed start a civilian airline. The government tries actually charging him on basis of putting his resources into selfish means because he's still pursuing his peaceful projects. World War One ends, and in comes the Versailles Treaty. Now, first off, Junkers thinks it's pretty well positioned because it's the guys making non-warplanes. It's got a very sturdy design, the F-13, and it figures it actually gets huge orders for this from the USA. The US Postal Service wants them. So they start to basically piece these together to ship these to the USA, and no, the authorities seize a shipment and say, no, Germany, under the Versailles Treaty, we are forbidding all aircraft research and production. So, all right. Now, so the company's in big trouble. How does it survive as an aircraft company? Well, they have tools and they have systems. They got stoves and water heaters. They start doing stuff. They make cutlery. They make flatware. They make whatever they can to survive. While trying to figure out what to do, they try and see can they make a licensed production over in America. They have some teething troubles there. They try some other things, but then the German military come to them. They've had this idea. We're going to get around Versailles, and they're keeping the secret from the German government itself. But what they're going to do is they're going to make air production facilities in Russia, post-revolutionary communist Russia. And they're going to make aircraft there, but what they're going to do is it'll be making Russian aircraft, but they can send German pilots out there to train, and they'll get trained air crew for, and they guess for the next war. So what they do is propose this to the Russians, and Russians are very keen on it. But Trotsky and Lenin specifically ask the involvement of Hans Junkers. He's a known socialist, and he is seen as the technical cutting edge of his age. So they come to Junkers and say, we want you to set this thing up. And Junkers, well, it doesn't look profitable. How's this going to work? The military said, we have a budget. We will underwrite it. You just send over the equipment. If it makes civil aircraft, obviously you will be a shareholder, and so you'll get money. Don't worry. But we will underwrite any losses. So, all right, sounds good, and Junkers can actually start making things and working on these designs and getting things done. So off they go. And it's an absolute disaster. The post-revolutionary Russian economy is not set up for this. There's no infrastructure, there's no rails, there's no roads. They cannot provide not only high-tech things like duralumium, they can't provide aircraft-grade wood, and they certainly cannot provide staff who are skilled in machine tooling. So Junkers has to send out his own guys under his own paycheck, and what they end up doing is they end up making plane parts, shipping them to Russia and piecing them together over there. Now this means these aircraft are incredibly expensive and can't be sold, not at a reasonable profit. They're just so spendy. So the thing starts going under. Meanwhile, there is a change in government. Because Germany falls behind in its reparation payments to France. 1925, France seizes the German industrial heartland, the Sudetenland. They actually march troops over and take it, and they say, we're going to take the reparations in kind, mostly coal. We're going to seize this. Where are all the air parts being made to send out to Russia? Well, in the Sudetenland. So whole ventures over there. Junkers is out the whole investment because the army now disavows the whole project. We've never heard of it. You can't sue us because it was a secret project. We've kept this thing secret. Junkers are aware, and there is actually an aim to this. All aircraft manufacturers were sponsored by the state at this period, and indeed today. Junkers was private, entirely privately owned. No government stake. They can't control what he makes. They want him to make warplanes. He isn't. He's working on liners and cargo planes all the time. He's put up a few little entries for these one-engined aircraft things that the army puts up, which were supposed to be disguised fighter planes, but they're always aimed as being a mail plane or what have we. They want to control Junkers. Bankrupting him is a way of taking him over, getting his patents and getting his staff, and running the direction of the company. The government falls, everything goes into free fall. The mark starts like halving in value, halving in value, halving in value. Junkers is actually looking after his entire workforce. He's got 6,500 people working for him now, and he's their lifeline. This is the Junkers familia, the family. So what he does is, so the right-wing government actually falls, and a more left-wing one is brought in. They're forcing Junkers now to try and sell his interest in his company so that they will seize it. But what he's done is, he's kept copies of the paperwork. He circulates the secret deal made with the army to 60 members of the cabinet and just lets them have at it. Secret deal which they weren't told. Money from actual government budget has been misappropriated and used for these things. The government has turned away from the entire Russian deal. They're trying to build closer ties with France now. We don't want the Russians. We're not that keen actually on the Russians because they go down a dark path. So net result is they acknowledge there is a deal. They don't cover his losses, but they do allow him to continue operating, and some money does come in. Junkers is alive again. It's in this context that he starts sending these overseas flights, trying to make these long distance flights. Now, this doesn't last. What he does is goes on with innovating, goes on trying to make more little airlines. But we're getting into the end of the 30s and the Nazi Party is arising. A right-wing wave is just sweeping over Germany. He starts to get these terrifying letters from people. And in amongst them we get things like, here's one, National Socialist Party from Dessau. Right. Germany is awake. Now is the time for the big clean-up. Now order will be maintained in our fatherland, and Germany will be liberated from parasites of democracy, for which the Third Reich has no place. The public will know what's up, and then heaven help you, you old socialist. Heaven help you. This is what he's getting. So, he's gone back to making airlines. Right-wing government comes in, they renationalise all the airlines and say there's only one airline in Germany, it's Deutsche Lufthansa, and they basically force him to sell all his shares at zero value. Company's ruined. They then force a vote of no confidence in him, and he's pushed out. Right, so they nationalise his airlines, it ruins him again, and this time they managed to do a deal. They push him out, but he's still got all of these tech patents. Basically every advanced tech patent for all of these engines. He owns Junkers Humo, which is an engine research company. He owns Junkers Aviation. The Nazis come in. Almost on day one, they nationalise Junkers. Old Hans, who is now 75 years old, is walking, he still walks every day. He's seized by two policemen and he's thrown into house arrest. They cut his phone, he's not able to see his lawyer, his family. They want those patents. What the Nazis want to do is make a central technological bank of all technological patents so that all the different war industries can draw on them for the rearming of Germany. He says no, not for war, and certainly not for nothing. So they start leaning on him more and more. They threaten first to fire everyone. Not so worried, but then the Gestapo starts seizing people and interrogating them. Yes, they are beating the living daylights out of his friends and out of his colleagues. So suddenly he's in some real trouble. Now this lasts for a year, and on his 76th birthday he gets a final visit from the Gestapo. There's no record of what happened on that day. At the end of that day, Professor Hans Junkers, socialist, pacifist, inventor, is dead. His terrorized widow has handed over all of the patents for nothing, 1% of their worth. And that's... So Junkers is taken over by Milch, a Nazi, a war criminal, convicted for it. He was doing medical experiments on prisoners, and they become the premier workhorse of technological development for the Third Reich. And this is how they're remembered. The Nazis wanted to shackle that futuristic technical innovation to the Nazi Party. It becomes part of their vision, and that's how they're remembered. However, that is a usurped legacy. The true legacy of Hans Junkers is a vision of a man of peace, a man who honestly thought that if we turned away from looking at aircraft as weapons of war and instead as machines of culture, exchange and peace, that a better world will come. And that's a beautiful vision, and that's what I'd like him to be remembered for. What happened in the end? Robert Bosch, he went on, seized by the Nazis, he escaped. He diversified all of his company so that it was manufacturing in Australia and South Africa and Britain. Bosch is still running today. A lot of the Junkers patents had actually been snuck over to Bosch. They still run today, Junkers Bosch. When Bosch died, he had a will that left all of the profits from the Bosch company to go to charity. That still holds today. Adolf Dirthmann, who was running the Junkers company, well, Gestapo seized him, put him in a concentration camp. Eventually he got out. He was released on the basis that he had nothing to do with aircraft and that he couldn't go back to his hometown again. So he opened an antiquarian bookshop in Hamburg, which seems to have existed in slightly mysterious circumstances. He kept up his communist contacts. It looks like the place was being run essentially as a message drop for the anti-Hitler underground. Bosch, by the way, ran a very successful anti-Hitler underground, saved hundreds of people, shipping them out and saving them from concentration camps. Dirthmann seems to have done the same. He seems to have been part of the underground. After the war, founded the Communist Party of Germany, good old man, and actually went on with running his bookshop on the side. He ended up as a industrial advisor for Hamburg, and he was behind many of the very liberal labour laws that came into Germany post-war. These guys made their mark. Walter Gropius from the Bauhaus, Junkers actually had started manufacturing furniture with him, and that kind of gave the Bauhaus their solid stance. So these guys' legacy is out there. Now, back to our old friend the aviator, Hans. Good old Hans. He went on, and Bertram became a film director. He wrote 13 films. He got 6 of them out. He got 9 of them out. He directed 6. He had a very, very, very fertile career. He was still producing up until 1985. Sterling Gentleman, did many, many talks. And I think we might end this. Let's watch some of Hans Bertram's Brides for Golden Hill, a movie he said about Australia and wrote just after coming back from his journey with the crocodiles. Cheers!
Ich bin eine Frau, die Männer betört, die mit allen spielt und keinem gehört. Und ich will so bleiben, ich bin wie ich bin. Ich habe ein Lächeln, das niemand versteht, das die Männer ranzieht wie ein Magnet. Und ich will so bleiben, ich bin wie ich bin. Man wollte mich ändern und hat's oft probiert, doch man hat mich dabei unterschätzt. Ich habe im Leben fast immer riskiert und alles auf eine Karte gesetzt. Ich bin eine Frau, die Männer betört, die mit allen spielt und keinem gehört. Und ich will so bleiben, ich bin wie ich bin.